The Northern Highlands Central Valley was 3 hours from the survey's Day 3 base camp, which meant the crash site was 3 hours from help in the direction he had come from and 8 miles from the outpost in the direction he was going. He had found it by the smoke. The Highlands air was the Highlands air, the specific quality of frontier world atmosphere in the elevated terrain, the thin and cold and clear quality that the survey's respiratory supplementation addressed, and which produced, in the undisturbed quality of the Highlands morning, the visibility of smoke from a significant distance. He had gone toward it because the smoke in the Highlands' undisturbed air was the smoke of something that was not supposed to be there, which was the category of things that required investigation before anything else was determined. The wreckage was still warm. He assessed this immediately. The debris field's temperature, the emergency system's cycling quality, the specific evidence of recent impact, and built from the assessment the understanding that this had come down in the last few hours, and that the last few hours were the window of the survival probability for anyone who had been in it. He went through the debris field with the quality of someone who was looking for the thing that mattered first. She was at the field's eastern edge, at the position where the transport's secondary compartment had come to rest. The position that the debris field's distribution indicated was the position with the most structural protection from the impact, which was the position that someone who had known the impact was coming would have positioned themselves in. She had known it was coming. He filed this. She was conscious. She was looking at him with the specific quality of someone who was in significant pain, and who was managing the pain with the capacity that the pain management required, which left the remaining capacity for the assessment that the situation required. The assessment was, who is this person and what does this person's presence mean for my situation? He said, I'm a Joint Authority Survey Specialist. I'm on a solo geological survey of the Northern Highlands. I found the crash by the smoke. She looked at him. He said, I'm going to help you. There's an outpost at the Highlands' southern edge, approximately 11 miles. I can get you there. She said, 11 miles. He said, the terrain is manageable. I've been through the route section from the valley to the ridge in the survey's first week. I know where the difficult sections are. She looked at him with the assessment quality, the quality of someone who was evaluating the available options and who was evaluating the person presenting the option alongside the option itself. She said, yes. She said it in the quality of someone who had completed the evaluation and who was in the decision, not the relief quality of someone who was receiving rescue, the functional quality of someone who had assessed the available options and had chosen the best one. He looked at the injuries. The right leg's fracture was visible in the specific way that fractures under pressure were visible, the angle that the limb was not supposed to have, the swelling that had developed in the hours since the impact. The shoulder's damage was visible in the specific way of an impact injury. The shoulder's position, the range of motion that the shoulder's position indicated was not available. The temple's laceration had produced the blood loss that the dried blood and the pallor indicated. He said, I need to stabilize the leg before we move. The fracture needs support for the 11 miles. She said, the emergency kit. The transport's starboard storage, he found it. He stabilized the leg with the emergency kit's contents, in the way that the survey training's first aid component had covered. The specific technique for field fracture stabilization that was in the training, and which he had retained with the quality of someone who had done a sufficient number of solo field assignments, to understand that the field training's retention was the difference between the training being a record and the training being a resource. He said, this will hurt. She said, yes. He stabilized the leg. She did not make a sound. He noted this with the quality of someone who was noting something significant, not the performance of not making a sound, the specific quality of someone who had the capacity to manage a significant pain response, and who was applying the capacity with the efficiency of someone for whom the capacity was trained rather than performed. He said, I'm going to carry you. The configuration will be the position that protects the leg and the shoulder. The fracture needs to stay supported throughout. If anything changes, if the pain shifts, if the position needs adjustment, tell me immediately." She said, "Yes." He lifted her. The lift had the specific quality of the first moment of the 11 miles. The weight, the configuration, the specific arrangement of her weight in his arms that the injury required, and the specific quality of beginning something that was 11 miles long. He said, "I'm going to move at the pace the terrain requires. It won't be fast," she said. "The pace the terrain requires is the correct pace." He said, "Yes." He moved. The Highlands Central Valley was the beginning. The valley floor's terrain was the most manageable terrain of the 11 miles. The ground that was difficult in the ways of rocky and uneven, but not the ways of steep and technical. He had surveyed the valley's section in the first week, and he moved through it with the quality of someone who knew the ground. She was in his arms with the quality of someone who was managing their situation. The specific stillness of someone who was not adding unnecessary movement to the movement he was already managing. The quality of someone who understood that the 11 miles required the efficient management of everything that could be managed, and who was managing her part. He moved. The valley gave way to the highlands' first ridge. The first ridge's ascent was the first technical section, the ground that required the specific navigation of someone who was both carrying weight and managing the gradient simultaneously. He navigated it. She was quiet for the first 2 miles in the way of someone who was in the management of significant pain, and who was applying the management's full capacity to the management rather than to conversation. He did not attempt conversation. The 11 miles was the function, and the function's first requirement was the efficient execution of the terrain, and the efficient execution of the terrain did not require conversation. At the 3rd mile she said, "You're not military." He said, "No, survey specialist, geological assessment." She said, "You have first aid training." He said, "Solo field assignments require it." The frontier zone's remote survey work, the solo assignments specifically, require a higher first aid certification than the standard joint authority assignment because the solo assignment has no secondary response. She said, "You chose to help rather than to wait for the official response." He said, "The official response would have taken until the afternoon at the earliest. I would have needed to return to base camp to use the communication equipment, file the discovery, wait for the response to organize and dispatch. The afternoon is 6 hours from when I found you. Your injuries in the specific configuration therein, the blood loss, the fracture, 6 hours without movement toward medical care was the wrong calculation." She said, "You calculated it." He said, "Yes." She said quickly, he said, "The calculation was straightforward. The variables were time to official response, current injury condition, terrain distance to outpost, my capacity to cover the terrain carrying your weight. The calculation produced, move now." She was quiet. The 3rd mile gave way to the 4th. At the 4th mile's descent he adjusted her position. The leg stabilization had maintained its integrity, but the descent's angle required the position's specific modification to maintain the support throughout the gradient. He said, "I'm adjusting the position. The descent requires a different weight distribution." She said, "Yes." He adjusted. She said the adjustment was correct. He said, "Yes." The descent's angle puts different stress on the fracture's stabilization. The position needs to account for the stress direction. She said, "You understand the mechanics." He said, "The survey work involves the physical assessment of unstable terrain, the mechanics of weight and stress distribution in dynamic ground. The principles apply." She was quiet for the 4th mile. At the 5th mile's plateau, the Highlands Central Plateau that the survey's route had crossed in the first week, and that he had documented for its geological significance, she said. "The survey, the world's geology specifically." He said, "Yes." "The Northern Highlands mineral and structural assessment. The world has a significant crystalline substrate in the Highland Formation. The deep layer geological survey indicated a crystalline structure at the 3-kilometer depth range that the surface assessment's initial phase is characterizing." She said, the crystalline substrate's distribution in the Central Valley Formation. He said, yes. The Central Valley's formation is the surface expression of the deeper structure. The valley's specific topography is the result of the differential erosion between the crystalline substrate's harder inclusions and the surrounding matrix. She said, the survey documentation described the valley's topography as anomalous. He said, yes. He said it and then he said, you know the geological literature on this world. She said, I know this world. He said, more than the literature. She said, yes. He said, yes. He said it in the quality of someone who was filing the information, the assessment that the person he was carrying knew this world in a way that was not the survey literature's knowing, which was the knowing of someone who had been in relationship with this world's significance rather than in the survey relationship with its geology. He filed this and did not ask further because the 5 miles had produced the understanding that the asking would be answered when the answering was the thing she chose to do. He moved across the plateau. The plateau gave way to the highland's second ridge. At the 6th mile, she said, the stabilization is maintaining. He said, yes. The emergency kit's materials are holding. The descent from the first ridge stressed the configuration, but the adjustment held. She said, you adjusted without being asked. He said, the stress direction changed at the descent's angle. The adjustment was the appropriate response to the change. She said, you were monitoring, he said. The 11 miles requires the continuous monitoring of the injury's condition. The monitoring is the function's requirement. She was quiet. The second ridge's ascent was more technical than the first, the gradient steeper, the ground less stable, the sections where the footing required the specific attention of someone who was navigating uncertain terrain with full hands. He navigated it. At the 7th mile, the ridge's crest, the point where the survey's 3rd week had provided the panoramic documentation of the highland's extent, and where the outpost was theoretically visible in the far south on clear days, and this was a clear day, she said. Why are you doing this? He said. You needed help and I could help, she said. You're a survey specialist on a solo geological assignment on a remote frontier world. Helping me is not the function. He said, no, it isn't, she said. And yet, he said, and yet you were at the crash site and I could carry you to the outpost. The function wasn't the relevant consideration, she said. What was the relevant consideration? He said. That you were there and needed help and I was there and could help. That's the full set of relevant considerations. She said, it's dangerous. The highland terrain. He said, yes, I know the highland terrain. I've been in it for 3 weeks. The dangerous sections are manageable with the correct approach, she said, and the risk of carrying an injured person through the dangerous sections. He said, the risk is present. Yes, she said, and you accepted the risk. He said, yes, she said. Without calculating, he said, I calculated the route and the terrain and the injury's requirements. I didn't calculate whether to help. She was quiet. The 7th mile's crest gave way to the 8th mile's descent. The 8th mile's descent was the most technically demanding section. The steeper grade, the loose surface, the sections where the footing was the footing of someone who had to commit to each step without the certainty that the step would hold. He had noted this section in the survey's 3rd week as the section requiring the most careful navigation. He navigated it carefully. She did not speak during the descent. He did not speak during the descent. The descent required the full quality of his attention, and the full quality of the attention was the descent. At the 8th mile's base, at the section where the terrain flattened into the highland's southern approach, she said, Savin Rel. He said, yes, she said. That's your name? He said, yes. I told you at the crash site. She said, yes. I'm telling you that I'm keeping it. He said, yes. She said, in the Varath tradition, the name of the person who helped you in the significant moment is the name that is kept. He said, kept how? She said, remembered. The specific quality of being held in the memory with the significance the moment had. The name is not kept in the formal sense, it's kept in the personal sense. He said, yes. He said it with the quality of someone who was receiving the information about the tradition. and who was also receiving the specific quality of the person telling him the tradition, which was the quality of someone who was telling him something that was personal rather than informational. He said, "Thessaly." She said, "Yes." He said, "Your name from the 9th mile." She said, "Yes." He said, "I've been keeping it since you told me." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Yes." She said it with the quality of the significant thing received. The 9th mile gave way to the 10th. At the 10th mile, she said, "The fracture. How much further can the stabilization hold?" He said, "The emergency kit stabilization is designed for the field transit period. The 11 miles is within the design's range, but the lower end of it. The stabilization will hold for the outpost." She said, "And after?" He said, "After the outpost is the medical functions problem. The outpost has medical capability. The fracture needs the medical function. I can get you there." She said, "Yes." He said, "Yes." At the 10th mile's end, the outpost was visible. He said, "There." She said, "Yes, I see it." He said, 20 minutes. "The terrain is flat from here." She said, "Yes." He said, "You're going to be all right." She said, "Yes." She said it in the quality of someone who was certain of the outcome and who had been certain of the outcome since the 7th mile and who was, in the 10th mile's end, in the certainty's presence without the uncertainty having been the thing she had been managing. He said, "You've been certain since the 7th mile." She said, "Yes." He said, "The 7th mile is when I told you the dangerous sections were manageable with the correct approach." She said, "Yes. That was when I was certain." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because you had been on the correct approach since the crash site, and the 7th mile's ridge crest was the evidence that the correct approach would continue to the outpost." He said, "You were evaluating the approach." She said, "I've been evaluating the approach since the crash site." "Yes," he said, and she said, "The approach has been correct throughout." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." He moved across the flat terrain toward the outpost. The outpost's perimeter gate was the gate of a standard frontier outpost. The Joint Authority's configuration for the remote frontier world security function. The gate that was manned by the standard security personnel, whose function was the management of the outpost's access. He came through the gate with Thessaly in his arms. He said to the guard, "She's injured. Leg fracture, shoulder damage, temple laceration with blood loss. She needs the medical facility immediately." The guard looked at Thessaly. He communicated. The medical response came in 2 minutes, the stretcher, the medical personnel, the specific efficient quality of a medical response that knew what it was doing. He transferred Thessaly to the stretcher with the specific care that the transfer required. The fractured leg support maintained through the transfer. The shoulder's position managed. The specific moment of the transfer where the weight left his arms and the medical function received it. The transfer was complete. He stood at the outpost's entry with the specific quality of someone who had completed 11 miles of highland terrain with an injured person, and who was in the completion's physical aftermath. The tiredness that settled into the body when the sustained effort concluded, the specific weight of the now-ended function. 3 minutes passed. The secondary arrival came through the outpost's internal gate, 8 people. They had the quality of people whose function was the protection of a specific individual, and who had been in the sustained urgent search for the duration of the transport's absence, and who were in the found things presence with the specific quality of people who had been in the urgency for long enough that the urgency's resolution was physically present in them. The senior security officer was at the front. He was Varath, the physiological markers clearly Varath, the bearing clearly the bearing of someone in the security function's senior capacity, and he moved with the quality of someone who had located the person he had been looking for and who was in the locating's immediate aftermath. He went to the medical stretcher. He went to one knee. He said, "Your Majesty." The medical personnel paused. The outpost staff paused. The outpost was in the quality of a room that had encountered the unexpected significant thing and was in the unexpected significant thing's presence, not the chaos of the unexpected, the specific suspended quality of the significant. He was standing at the entry. He was holding the weight of the completion. the 11 miles, the terrain, the specific knowledge that the person in his arms had been the person in his arms, and was now the person on the medical stretcher, and was also the person who the senior security officer had gone to one knee for. Thessaly looked at him from the stretcher. She looked at him with the quality of her full attention, not the managed quality of the 11 miles pain management, the full quality of the person who had been in 11 miles with him, and who was in the outpost's moment, and who was, in the moment, in the specific quality of someone who was in two things simultaneously. The revelations present and the 11 miles past. She said, to the room's assembled attention, in the register that was not the official register and was not the diplomatic register, but was the register of someone who was introducing a person to a context. The survey specialist, she said, Savin Rel, the Joint Authorities Geological Survey Specialist who found the crash site and carried me 11 miles through the northern highland terrain to this outpost. The room received this, she said. He is to be given the full hospitality of this outpost and everything he requires. The senior security officer looked at him. He said, Yes, Your Majesty. Thessaly looked at him at Savin and she said, the survey specialist. She said it in the specific register of the Varath tradition she had described at the 10th mile, the register of the name that was kept, the name held with the significance of the moment that produced the keeping. She said it in the register of someone who was, in the outpost's moment, holding the name with the significance the 11 miles had. He said, Yes. She was taken to the medical facility. He stood at the outpost's entry with the 8-person security detail, and the outpost's paused staff and the specific quality of the outpost at the moment after the significant thing. The senior security officer came to him. He said, Her Majesty is the Varath Empress. She has been in transit on a private survey of the frontier zone's remote worlds for the past 3 weeks. The transport's failure was a navigational system malfunction. He said, Yes. He said it with the quality of someone who was receiving information that was reorganizing the previous 11 miles context, not the information's drama, the information itself, the specific thing the information was. The senior security officer said, You carried her 11 miles, he said. The outpost was the closest medical facility. The security officer said, Yes, I know, he said, and the terrain between the crash site and the outpost. He said, Yes. I know the terrain. I've been surveying it for 3 weeks. The security officer said, Yes. He said it in the quality of someone who was in the presence of something that required the quality. He said, Her Majesty has requested that you be present for a conversation when the medical function has addressed the immediate requirements. She was specific about the request. He said, Yes. He was taken to the outpost's hospitality facility, the room that the outpost maintained for the significant visitors that the frontier zone's remote outposts occasionally received, and which was, in the current context, being used for the Joint Authority Survey Specialist who had carried the Varath Empress 11 miles through the northern highland. He sat. He was in the tiredness of the 11 miles and in the quality of the 11 miles completion, and in the specific quality of the outpost's revelation. The Your Majesty, the security detail, the room's pause, Thessaly on the stretcher saying the survey specialist in the register of the name that was kept. He thought 11 miles. He thought the fracture and the shoulder and the temple and the emergency kit stabilization and the first ridge and the second ridge and the plateau and the descent and the flat terrain and the gate. He thought Thessaly. He thought, yes. He thought. Her Majesty the Varath Empress was at the crash site in the eastern edge of the secondary compartment's remains, and was conscious, and was managing the pain with the capacity of someone whose capacity was trained, and was looking at me with the assessment quality of someone evaluating the available options. He thought, and the available options produced yes. He thought. She said yes in the quality of someone who had assessed the available options and had chosen the best one. He thought, and the best one was me. He sat with this. He sat with it for the time the sitting required. The tiredness present, the completion present, the revelation present, and the quality of the person he had been carrying for 11 miles also present. Which was the quality that was distinct from the revelation, and which was the quality that had been accumulating across the 11 miles, in the way that the real quality of a person accumulated across the sustained proximity of a significant shared effort. He thought she evaluated the approach from the crash site. He thought, and the 7th mile was when she was certain. He thought, because the 7th mile's ridge crest was the evidence that the correct approach would continue. He thought, she had been in the evaluation for 7 miles. He thought, yes. The medical function addressed the immediate requirements in 4 hours. He knew this because the senior security officer provided the information at the 2-hour mark and at the 4-hour mark, which was the information management of a significant situation by someone who was doing the information management correctly. At the 4-hour mark, the security officer came to the hospitality facility and said, "Her Majesty is in the recovery room and has requested your presence." He went. The recovery room had been organized with the specific arrangement that the protection function required, the security personnel's positions, the access management, the specific arrangement of the room that the protection of a significant person in a medical context produced. He had been in enough joint authorities protected facilities to read the arrangement, and to move through it with the quality of someone who understood the arrangement's purpose, and who was not going to complicate the purpose. Thessaly was in the medical bed. The fracture stabilization was the medical function stabilization rather than the emergency kits, the proper medical hardware, the specific medical management of the injury that the outpost's capability provided. The shoulder's repair was visible in the dressing's configuration. The temple's closure had the specific quality of a wound that had been properly addressed. She was in the quality of someone who had been through significant physical distress and who was in the recovery's beginning, not the diminished quality of someone who had been reduced by the distress, the specific quality of someone who was in the recovery with the full quality of their attention, the full capacity present in the recovery rather than the managed capacity of the distress's management. He sat, she said, "I want to ask you something." He said, "Yes," she said, "at the crash site, when you decided to carry me 11 miles, what were you thinking?" He said, "I was thinking about the terrain and the route and the injury's specific requirements. The first ridge's approach, the plateau's extent, the second ridge's technical sections, the fracture's stabilization requirements for the gradient changes, the blood loss's implication for the timeline." She said, "Not what you were calculating, what you were thinking." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I was thinking you needed to get to the outpost and that I could get you there." She said, "Yes." He said, "That's the full content of the thinking." The calculation was the mechanism of the thinking. The terrain assessment and the injury assessment and the timeline assessment were the calculation. The thinking was, "This person needs to get to the outpost and I can get her there," she said. And the calculation's details didn't complicate the thinking. He said, "The calculation's details informed the how. The thinking was prior to the calculation." She said, "Yes." She was quiet. He said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Yes." He said, "The crash site. The eastern edge of the secondary compartments remains." She said, "Yes." He said, "You positioned yourself there." She said, "Yes." The secondary compartment's position in the transport's configuration has the most structural protection from the forward impact direction. The navigational failure produced the impact at the forward angle. I moved to the secondary compartment when the failure was confirmed. He said, "You had time to move." She said, "Approximately 40 seconds from the failure confirmation to the impact." "Yes," he said, "and you used the 40 seconds to move to the safest position." She said, "Yes." He said, "Not to prepare for rescue," she said. The communication systems failed with the navigational system. The 40 seconds wasn't sufficient for both the position and the communication. He said, "You chose the position." She said, "Yes," he said. Because the position was the survivable choice and the communication in 40 seconds was not, she said, yes. The calculation was, the position extends the survival window. The communication in 40 seconds produces an incomplete transmission that may or may not be received and acted on before the survival window closes. The position was the correct choice, he said, and the survival window, she said, was the window in which you arrived. He said, yes. He said it with the quality of someone who was in the full understanding of what he was saying. The survival window and the 40 seconds and the correct choice and the 3 hours that had passed between the impact and his arrival at the crash site and the 11 miles that followed. She said, yes, she said. I want to tell you something about the 11 miles, he said. Yes, she said. I have been the Varath Empress for 9 years. In 9 years I have been in the significant rooms function, the decisions, the diplomatic engagements, the institutional responsibilities. In 9 years of the significant room I have been surrounded by people who are in relationship with the function the Empress represents. He said, yes. She said, the people in relationship with the function are the people whose engagement with me is the engagement with the Empress. The capability she has, the authority she carries, the institutional significance she represents. The engagement is genuine. It's not performed. The people are genuinely in relationship with those things. He said, yes. She said, and in 9 years I have learned to read the specific quality of that engagement, the quality of the person who is genuinely in relationship with the Empress and the quality of the person who is genuinely in relationship with Thessaly. The two qualities are different. The first is common. The second is not, he said. Yes, she said. At the crash site you didn't know you were in relationship with the Empress. He said no. She said, you were in relationship with Thessaly. The person who was at the Eastern Ed.